Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer.
Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Where we once sang, sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us, in response to being taunted and insulted, this idiom, like so many other childhood memories, turned out to be untrue. The words we use have taken a deeper significance, and they can be extremely hurtful and painful. In this episode, we're joined by Connie Zweig. Connie's a retired Jungian psychologist and therapist, a writer, a climate reality project leader, and citizens climate lobbyist. She is co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, and author of A Moth to the Flame, The Life of Sufi Poet Rumi, and The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends her work on the shadow into midlife and beyond, and explores aging as a spiritual practice. Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening, is her latest book. Connie's work often intersects with psychology, spirituality, and self-help, focusing on themes of self-discovery, personal integration, and the exploration of our inner depths. So let's get started.
Hey, Don.
Hi, Connie. Nice to see you on Zoom. How are you?
Okay. Long time no see.
Yeah, it's been a very long time. A couple of years.
So what are we doing here?
Well, the last time we talked, I was working on my master's degree. I was trying to put climate change and denial together. So I wrote a paper as my thesis, Climate Change and the Many Faces of Denial, which you helped me with. And now I'm working on my PhD, trying to understand the cause and effect of polarization and how we navigate difficult conversations. So I wanted to catch up and ask you some more questions.
Well, let me start by saying I'm really respect you for doing your doctorate in this stage of life. I did mine in my 40s. So I understand for me, it was like a midlife thing. And for you, it's a later life thing. And it's really a passion project. So I get it.
I hadn't been in school for 40 years when I went back to do my master's in 2015. And I loved it so much.
Yeah.
But thank you. How about your latest book? I think I'm about 40 pages in. And one of the things that jumped out to me was where you wrote that we have a global identity crisis. I thought this is perfect. So maybe that's a good place to start, the journey that got you to this new book.
Okay. So you're referencing Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path. When I worked in book publishing in the 1980s, I was very interested in Carl Jung, and depth psychology. And I entered Jungian analysis and began to explore my own shadow, my own unconscious in my dreams. And at that time, I put together a book, which was a collection of expert thinkers on the shadow that was called Meeting the Shadow. And then later, I went back for my doctorate and wrote a book called Romancing the Shadow, which is really a method that I developed with a colleague for how to recognize when our unconscious shadow material is erupting, whether it's in a repeating fight with a partner or an addiction or a depression or a projection onto other people. And so Romancing the Shadow was about sort of how we work with our unconscious material in everyday life. And in between, then I ended up writing a novel about the Sufi poet Rumi when I was really steeped in his poetry. And I became a clinician. So for 30 years, I worked as a clinical psychologist and tried to help my clients understand their own unconscious process, how they were sabotaging themselves, and how they could work with the eruption of the shadow to begin to meet their conscious intentions rather than sabotage them. And then when I entered my 60s and I began to think about retiring from after 30 years in clinical practice, I looked for writing about the unconscious shadow and age and retirement. And there was nothing, not a single book. Thousands of books about aging, but nothing about the hidden unconscious beliefs and images and feelings and behaviors that we have about growing older in this culture. So I remember I said to my husband one day, looks like I got to write it. And so I began my research for The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, which explores how we meet the shadow in midlife and beyond, and how that stage of life in the unconscious is really different from the other stages of life, and uncovered a lot of, what I call shadow characters, like the inner ageist that keeps us from really self-acceptance at this time, and actually gives a lot of people shame about how the body's changing or their dependency needs and things like that. Or what I call the doer, which keeps us in a heroic, frantic doing mode because we can't slow down to self-reflect if we're in that shadow character, and many more. And a lot about purpose in that stage of life, whether it's activism for some people or spiritual practice for some people. And I was very fortunate to get a lot of interviews with spiritual teachers in different traditions for that book. And then my dissertation in an earlier time had been called The Holy Longing, which was about our spiritual yearning for transcendence or for the divine, for the self, for non-duality, whatever we call it. And I had published a very early book about that. And my publisher came back and said, let's revise that book now that we've had the Me Too movement and re-examine that whole issue of spirit and shadow. What is going on in the unconscious in our religious and spiritual lives? And so I keep extending my work into these different arenas. And it's just kind of unfolded that way. It's been very meaningful and profound for me. I had an experience when I was in my 20s with a meditation community that kind of went awry. And so I feel very connected to this material about the shadow on the spiritual path, and interviewed a lot of people, and also realized that as I did the research, I realized how many contemporary spiritual teachers are acting out their shadows now, today, in this moment. And I was kind of shocked by that. And so it made me realize how many people must be suffering about that heartbreak and trauma. And so I developed spiritual shadow work to offer people guidance in that setting, in that context. So that's kind of how my career has unfolded. And today I'm a wife and a grandma, and practicing the shift from role to soul, which is the shift in identity from what I do to who I really am, to my spiritual nature. And that's really going to be the practice for the next few years as I slow down this work mode that I've been in for so long.
I really appreciate you sharing so much. It's quite an amazing journey. When we first talked, we were talking about the shadow and how the shadow sits right beside the ego, what we deny consciously or unconsciously. How does the shadow figure into polarization? Are we more polarized now than we've ever been, or have we always been polarized?
Well, I'm kind of a developmental theorist, so I see humanity as going through stages of development. And although we're in these very urgent, interconnected crises right now, so many of them, there are also people having spiritual breakthroughs all over the planet. And so it's interesting to me that these are both going on at the same time. The climate crisis, the political polarization and the hatred and anger, the gun violence crisis, the threat to democracy. And at the same time, there are all these people having profound experiences of awakening. So I see that developmentally. And it seems to me that humanity has always, on a kind of naturally, inevitably projected the material that's disowned in our shadow, that's unacceptable to us, onto others. And so this is how we create an us and a them. And when people are particularly threatened, there's a theory in psychology called the terror management theory. When people are particularly threatened, either with their physical existence or their identity is threatened or their livelihood is threatened, they entrench more intensely into the people who are like them, who they believe share their identity and their worldview, and they create a tribe. And whether it's a Christian religious tribe, or whether it's a political conservative tribe, or whether it's a race-based identity and tribe, people want to build safety from that existential threat of death through belonging and through tribe. And so it seems to me that what's happened is when we say us, we're the tribe, then we project the shadow of the otherness onto different groups. And so maybe people of color hold the otherness, or immigrants, or Russians, or whatever the group that holds the enemy. It's like the enemy making happens at a deeply unconscious level. And it's rooted in this fear of threat. My existence is threatened. My home is threatened. My family is threatened, my livelihood, my identity is threatened. And so what we're seeing today, I think, is a real intensification of something that's always been there. It's an intensification, and it's also more public facing because of the way the media presents it now in social media. And so we're seeing everywhere, especially, post-Trump, but I would say this is a global phenomenon, dividing into these subgroups that are deeply tribal. For people who might be listening and know about the chakras, the chakras are in the subtle body of human beings, the energy body. The third chakra is, the second chakra is the tribal chakra. So if people haven't moved beyond that level of development into the heart chakra with compassion and unity with humanity, but they remain in only my group is good, right? Only my group is going to heaven. Only my group should run the government. Only my group should have guns. Only my group should pass laws or know what's right or will be saved. So if people haven't moved beyond that level of identity, then anything other is a threat and turned into the enemy. And so I think we're seeing that now very intensely, and we're seeing politicians using that understanding now, weaponizing that understanding to make the polarization worse, not to bring people together and unify the country, but actually to make it worse for their own ends. And it's tragic. It's really tragic.
I'm curious, do you think that racism and prejudice are innate or learned?
I think that what I'm describing, this process of projection, is innate. Everybody does it. But it doesn't show up in racism in everybody, right? So a white person doesn't automatically project onto a Black or brown person. A Black or brown person doesn't automatically project onto someone in another group. That arises with the collective soup in which we swim. The family, the religious community, the media, the schools. And so mostly I think racism is learned, but the root of racism in projection is innate, it's inherent. Somebody is going, it's kind of like we all have a quiver behind us, and every once in a while we pull out an arrow and we shoot it. And sometimes the projection fits. So we might say, that person is a lazy couch potato. And sometimes the projection fits and that person is lazy. But other times we're attributing our own laziness, which we can't see in ourselves, onto the other person. And the projection doesn't fit. So if we look at the immigration crisis in that way, it's all about stereotyping. It's all about generalizations and fear. People's fear of survival, as I said. And so in that case, the projections don't fit most of the time. So, and the same with ageism, same process with ageism. We live in a really ageist society. And so we have to actually do inner work to get free of racism and ageism in which we swim. It's everywhere. And I think that people can get free of that. They can work that through, but there are not too many people who are kind of taking that on as their developmental task. And in fact, in many ways, it looks like we're going in the wrong direction. I mean, critical race theory is now being eliminated from schools and libraries are closing, and the whole thing is going the other way. Again, rooted in fear of the other, us and them.
One of my questions for you was, how do cultural, societal, or demographic factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, or political affiliation influence the dynamics of our conversations? And that's pretty much what you're talking about.
That's right. And for a lot of people, they're unconscious influences. But for other people, they're very conscious. So, for example, I identify with being a progressive Democrat. That doesn't mean that I don't identify with other kinds of people who think differently, humanity. But I have a Trump supporter in my family. And we kind of have an explicit agreement not to talk politics because we haven't found a way to do it. I have psychological ideas about why all the people who support Trump feel that way. I have my psychological ideas about that, but it's very foreign to me. And so I find other ways to care for this person. I will say, Don, that I see similarities in the Trump cult with my new book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, which is about why we're drawn to charismatic teachers and leaders, why we stay devoted to them and identified with them. I'm looking at it in the religious and spiritual arena, but it translates into the political arena. And so there's psychology there that interests me about how that happens and why that happens for people.
I think many of us have watched people we love disappear into cults or online rabbit holes. My sister and I grew up in the same family, and yet we have different values and beliefs. She thinks Trump is a patriot, her words. It seems that calling them out is easier than calling them in, and you found a way to do that. Alicia Garza from Black Lives Matter said that social movements that need to grow often devote more energy to keeping people out than pulling people in. So I guess it's that art of pulling people in or trying to keep the relationship close. At least if we can keep people we love close, even if we don't agree, there's always an opportunity to expose them to different information at some point, and that may help change hearts and minds.
I was in Berkeley in the late 60s and 70s, and this conversation about political common ground with our adversaries is an old conversation. And I think that, when a lot of members of Congress are interviewed, they talk about that. They talk about working across the aisle on this issue because they agree on it and they don't agree on anything else. So yes, if we could do that in our personal lives, what it means is, there are a few levels to this. So I can see beauty in this man. I can see traits that are very positive for his family. At the same time, I can see his self-centeredness and his blind spots and his values that for me are destroying the planet. And so I have to hold both of those. I have to hold the positive and the negative in order to have a relationship with him. If I cut off one or the other, then we both lose. Some people who do shadow work would say, I have to find the Trump inside, the Trump within, right? And I had this conversation with a psychiatrist a couple nights ago who was telling me about a client and reporting how upset he was with who this client was. And I said to him, all the traits you're describing sound like Trump. Is there that place in you that is rejected by your ego, that's unacceptable on a conscious level, but that's in you? And he went, oh, okay. The self-centeredness, the arrogance, the black and white thinking. So he was looking at it in himself. And that's a different way of developing compassion for the other. So, I think without being able to find common ground, we can't get anything done. People are motivated in different ways to do this inner work. Like I had other friends who they were liberal Dems who had a conversion experience and suddenly became right wing. I tried to talk to them, but it didn't matter. There was a point where okay, we can't talk to each other. We can't find the common ground. So we let go. And that's okay. That's okay. There's no shoulds about this. I think that it's very individual. And so let's make the analogy to religious clergy or spiritual teachers. At what point do you separate and leave them? At what point do you realize that this person is narcissistic and authoritarian and abusive, and you must go? And that was kind of a question that drove me when I was writing this book. And if you believe that person is awake or enlightened, how would you evaluate his behavior in another setting? If it were a secular setting and that were a professor, would that be abuse? And everybody I interviewed said, yes, of course. But we just make up all these rationalizations for why it's okay in a religious and spiritual setting. You know, he said, if I do this, I'll go to heaven or I'll become enlightened. And if I don't do it, my whole family will go to hell. And we make up reasons about, you know, I've identified with this for 25 years, so it can't be true. He can't be an alcoholic or he can't be raping women. It's not possible because my whole life would be meaningless. And that's part of what's happening, I think, in the Republican Party. It's a very similar process. There's kind of a reckoning going on. And there's a reckoning happening in all these religious and spiritual communities where there have been scandals of abuse, allegations of the abuse of power, abuse of sex, and abuse of money, financial coercion, which is a big one.
I'm just thinking about our conversation. One of the quotes that I've come to lately was an interview between D.T. Max and Stephen Sondheim, where Stephen Sondheim said, my idea is that every moment of human intercourse, like right now between you and me, there are 64 of you in the room and 64 of me in this room that we bring into our conversation. So every sentence we say is filled with layers. And we're talking about all of those layers in our conversations and how they move us to a particular place.
I'm not sure where he got the number 64, but for me, that reference is about the ancestors. So for me, as I sit here and, you know, transmit what I've learned over a lifetime, I can feel my parents and what they transmitted to me, and my grandparents and what they transmitted to me, and all of my spiritual teachers and what they transmitted, and my husband, who's very wise, and what he's transmitted. So I don't know where the 64 comes from, but I feel like I'm sitting in the place of many, many psyches, many people who've been my forebears, as well as my contemporaries. I mean, I can say that Jung's teachings are in me. Ken Wilber's teachings are in me. My husband's parents' teachings are in me. So it's a profound recognition that we are not isolated, separate, you know, autonomous entities.
This is a great discussion. I'm going to have to finish Meeting the Shadow and the Spiritual Path or book a session or maybe both. For me, the layers in the conversation are unpacking my own stuff. And in this particular case, my sister's beliefs and values with regards to Trump or her opinion about my son being trans. And there's a list of issues. And to your point, it's okay to let go, but it's also okay to wrestle with that tension.
Again, I think that's really individual preference. If somebody holds all the positions kind of opposite yours, it's difficult. It's really challenging. I live in a building where I get mocked for wearing a mask because the COVID rates are up right now, and I'm 74 years old, so I wear a mask. And people make comments, and so I'm aware in my own world that there are people near me with different values and different concerns, different anxieties, and different fears. And so I think if that comes up right in our family or in our friend circle, it can be really painful and it can be really tricky to navigate it. So I hear you with your sister. I also believe that some people are so identified with their worldviews. They are their worldviews. They are their beliefs. And that's a very small identity. That's a very tiny place to live in, what your head is telling you. So for those folks, I don't think there's much chance of debate. And my teaching about shifting from role to soul is about getting free of our belief systems, of our minds, of the narrow identities, the narrative self that tells us stories about who we are, and really expanding that out into some spiritual identity and whatever framework works for you. Whether it's your Buddha nature or your Christ nature or spirit or God or essence or higher self, actually beginning to cultivate that as your identity rather than I'm a progressive Democrat and blah, 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 because that's a fleeting identity. Or I'm a conservative Christian, or I'm, whatever it is, a queer Latina. These are narrow identities, and developmentally, they can be important at various stages of life, for sure, especially if they've been denied before. But in the end, it's not really deeply who you are. And, I don't have much to say about what's happening around gender identity and the trans issue, really, Dawn. I'm really not. It's not my specialization. What does interest me as a Jungian is that it is a way to hold opposites, to hold masculine and feminine in one body, which is really kind of interesting. And all of us do that anyway. We do it unknowingly. We have X and Y chromosomes and we have male and female hormones. But I think that the trans identity is a way of exploring that in a much more concrete, overt way. And, Carl Jung had this famous phrase about holding the tension of opposites. And that's kind of how I view that identity shift for people.
More to ponder and think about. So I know you've talked about role to soul and retirement, but what's on the horizon? What's next for you?
Well, I'm teaching a lot right now. I'm teaching the inner work of age and meeting the shadow on the spiritual path in online webinars, and people can find them on conniezweig.com if you're interested. And if you're interested in reading either of those books, I'm organizing book study groups. People all over the world are meeting online and forming circles to go through the books together, do the practices together. For the inner work of age, I have people who've met for several years now, and they're really aging in community doing this inner work. And for meeting the shadow on the spiritual path, there are people from all different denominations who are doing spiritual shadow work with others so that it's, they're less isolated in their experience of religious trauma. And they're organized by time zone. So if that interests any of our listeners, my email is conniezweig@gmail.com. And if you'll put book study in the subject line with which book, age book study or spirituality book study in the subject line, and give me your time zone, I will be glad to connect you so that you can share this experience with other people. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these groups now. So that's what I've been offering. And what's next for me is my husband and I are kind of aligning our slowing down process. So next year, we'll both be working a lot less and spending our time in different ways.
It sounds like a great plan, and I hope you can both slow down and enjoy each other in life. Like this conversation, I'm very grateful for your time and for all your help over the years. Your work has had a huge influence on my life. So thank you. I did want to comment on a passage in your newest book where you said, I'm calling for a reimagination of religious and spiritual life and a revised understanding of enlightenment on spiritual awakening that expands to the human shadow. That moved me. I'm quite struck by it.
Oh, you made my day. Thank you.
No,
People who start to meditate have this idea that or pray or whatever it is. They have this idea that it's just going to be all sweetness and light, and then they'll be enlightened and they won't suffer anymore. And this is naive and oversimplified. So I explored that issue in the book. How could people in advanced stages of consciousness be acting out their shadows? Because it's clearly happening. When you read chapter 5 of the book, it's all stories from people's direct experiences of spiritual abuse. How could that be happening? And so some people say, well, if they're doing that, they're not really enlightened. But I think that there are other explanations for this. And part of it is that we have not included the reality of the shadow in our vision of spiritual awakening. And that missing piece in both religion and spirituality, in most religion, it's split, right? There's God and the devil. There's the dark side and the light side. It's not included in the psychology of every human being. In my tradition of Vedanta, we call it the remains of ignorance, where people can be very evolved, but still have the remains of ignorance. And if they're unaware of it, they can act it out in a cruel comment or an angry outburst or whatever it is. So that's kind of the big vision for that book, to just make a little bit of a contribution to expanding the frame of spirituality and of the nature of awakening.
I love your work.
Thank you, John.
I'm very grateful for your time, and you've given us lots to think about.
Thank you.
And more to do.
I'm glad we did this, and I really wish you well with your research project.
Thanks, Connie. All the best.
Bye.
We've been talking with Connie Zweig. Connie's a retired therapist and co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. Her book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends her work on the shadow into midlife and beyond, and explores aging as a spiritual practice. Her new book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening, has just been released, and it's available online and at your favorite bookstore. You can learn more about Connie's work at conniezweig.com. Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones is part of my dissertation research project with the University of British Columbia. This radio program and podcast is produced at the Conversation Lab in Vancouver's downtown Eastside, on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. It's available on community and campus radio stations across Canada and your favorite podcasting platform. Please hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next episode. And if you have any comments, send me a note, dawn@theconversationlab.ca. Thanks to my supervisory committee, Drs. Manel Matani, Janice Stewart, Denise Ferrara da Silva, Jan Fook, and Andy Hoffman. My cohort at the UBC Social Justice Institute, friends and family who support this passion project, and Jason Shaw, who composed the music for us. Thanks for listening. I'm Don Schaefer.